Happy Wednesday and welcome to this week's episode of the Midweek Mini. We're continuing our Black Widow series, and today we're going to be talking about Mary Ann Cotton. Now, she was a pretty interesting lady, even if she was a bit murdery. So let's get this episode started.
Triple M Studios proudly presents Midweek Minis, and here's your host, Andrea Lee.
Now, like I said, Mary Ann Cotton was somewhat interesting. She holds the distinction of being Britain's very first serial killer, so if they were giving out awards for these such of things, she would have that award and probably a few others under her belt. Now, it's coming up on old Mary Ann's birthday. She was actually born on Halloween of 1832 in County Durham to Margaret and Michael Robson. So Robson was her maiden name. When Mary Ann was 8 years old, the family moved to a different area of County Durham, and shortly after they moved there, her father Michael, he died after he fell down this 150-foot mine shaft. Well, where they lived was the miner camp. So since her father had passed away and of course was no longer working for that company, they weren't only just mourning the loss of a father and husband, they were suddenly homeless too. So the following year, which was 1843, Mary Ann's mom, Margaret, she remarried to a guy named George Stott. When Mary Ann turned 16, she moved out of the family home to a nearby village to become a private nurse for a manager of the Merton Colliery. But 3 years later, she returned back to her stepdad's and mom's home to train as a dressmaker. And I just thought I'd let you know a colliery is a coal mine. I didn't know that, so I just thought I'd spread the knowledge. But anyway, now when she was 20, she got married to a colliery worker named William Mowbray. And soon after they married, they moved to southwest England. Well, in 1856, Mary Ann gave birth to their daughter, Margaret Jane. Now, I should mention that it has been said, or maybe rumored, that the couple had more children that passed away while they were living away from the County Durham, but it wasn't a law to register deaths or births at that time, so it's not a known fact one way or the other. But at some point after their daughter Margaret Jane was born, the little family moved back to northeast England, and in 1858, Mary Ann gave birth to a second daughter who they named Isabella. Sadly, their first daughter, Margaret Jane, passed away in 1860 when she was only around 4 years old. And the following year, though, Mary Ann gave birth to a third daughter who they also named Margaret Jane in memory of the first Margaret Jane. Now, in 1863, she gave birth to a son named John Robert Williams, but unfortunately, he passed away the next year from gastric fever, which I found in my search. It was a form of typhoid fever. Well, 2 years after Mary Ann's only son passed away, she became a widow. William passed away in January of 1865 from what they said was an intestinal disorder. Mary Ann received a pretty good payout from both her husband's and son's deaths from some life insurance policies that had been taken out through British and Prudential Insurance. So it makes you kind of raise an eyebrow early on in this story, an eyebrow of suspicion. But anyway, well, William wasn't hardly cold in his grave when she moved on to a new romance. She had moved to Seaham Harbor. She found herself in a relationship with Joseph Natras. And while she was dating this new man, her daughter, the second Margaret Jane, passed away from typhus fever. Well, after Margaret Jane the second passed away, Mary Ann packed up her belongings and sent her one remaining child to live with her mom, and she moved herself to Sunderland. Once she was there, she started working at the Sunderland Infirmary House of Recovery for the cure of a contagious fever Dispensary and Humane Society. That's a mouthful for a workplace. But while she was working there, one of her patients was this engineer named George Ward. And on August 28, 1865, the two of them tied the knot, but George was still a very sick man. He was suffering from something that caused paralysis and intestinal issues. Well, not even hardly quite 14 months after they got married, Mary Ann was a widow for the second time. Now, the official cause of death on the death certificate was the English cholera and typhoid, but a doctor that had taken care of George said that although George had been seriously ill, he was surprised that he had died so quickly from those illnesses. And guess what? Mary Ann collected more insurance money. Now, enter James Robinson. James was a recent widower. His wife Hannah had just recently died, so he hired Mary Ann to be his housekeeper in November of 1866. Well, a month after James had hired Mary Ann, his very young son, John, passed away from gastric fever. Well, he was very upset, very distraught, as you can imagine. I mean, he had just lost his wife and now a son. So what does he do? He turns to Mary Ann for comfort, and wham, she ends up pregnant. Now, not long after Mary Ann became pregnant for the umpteenth time, seriously, I've kind of lost count because, there's those maybe children that she'd had earlier. But anyway, shortly after she became pregnant, her mom, Margaret, came down with hepatitis. So Mary Ann went straight to her side so she could help take care of her. While Mary Ann was there, though, Margaret began to recover. But then she started complaining about really bad stomach pains. Well, in that spring of 1867, Mary Ann's mom, Margaret, passed away at the age of 54. And Mary Ann had only been there visiting her mom for 9 days when her mom died. So, yeah. Now, as you may remember, Margaret had been taking care of Mary Ann's daughter, Isabella. So she had to come back to the Robinson household with Mary Ann. Damn if she didn't start having stomach pains, and then she died. And then two of James's children, Elizabeth and James Jr., they passed away. Well, when Isabella died, Mary Ann received yet another insurance payout. So why is anyone not suspicious of all these people just dropping dead around her, other than me? I mean, everyone was just dropping dead. Well, I guess old James didn't suspect anything, and he married Mary Ann on August the 11th, 1867, and then that following November, the couple's first child was born, and it was a little girl named Margaret Isabella. But she only lived around 3 months because she got very sick and died the February after she was born. Mary Ann gave birth to the couple's son George on June 11, 1869, but it was around this time that James was finally starting to get suspicious of Mary Ann, because Mary Ann kept insisting that he take out a life insurance policy on himself. Well, his suspicions led him to do some investigating. And he found out that she had racked up a considerable amount of debt behind his back. And not only that, she had stolen money from him. Well, he did a little more snooping around, and he found out that Mary Ann had been forcing his older children to take some of the valuables from the home to pawn for money. Well, after learning all of this, he kicked Mary Ann out, and he kept their son George there with him. Well, when James kicked her out, she was basically living in the streets, but, she was pretty crafty, so she wouldn't be there long. Mary Ann, she had this friend named Margaret Cotton. There's a lot of Margarets in this story, but anyway, Margaret soon introduced Mary Ann to her brother Frederick. Well, like James, Frederick was also a widower, and he had lost 2 of his 4 children. Well, his sister Margaret had acted as a substitute mom to those 2 remaining children after their mom died, but she also passed away in March of 1870 from what they said was an undetermined stomach ailment. Well, Once again, Marianne found herself comforting a grieving man, and once again, Marianne found herself pregnant for what was believed to be her 12th time. Well, Marianne was still married to James, but she married Frederick anyway on September the 17th, 1870. Their son Robert was born the following year. Well, not long after little Robert was born, she found out that her old flame, Joseph Natras, was living pretty close by, and he was no longer married. So she convinced Frederick to move the family closer to him. In that very same year, Frederick died from gastric fever, and Marianne once again collected insurance payouts. Well, after James passed away, Joseph moved in with her, and you would think that she would be just happy that she had her lover to herself, but no. While Marianne was a private nurse to a man who was recovering from the smallpox, she was also becoming this man's lover, and his name was either John Quick Manning, but the thing about that name is there's no record of his existence that can be found, or his name was more likely Richard Quick Mann, who has been found in records and more likely to be the correct name. Well, anyway, she and this man became lovers, and Marianne was soon pregnant for the 13th time. Well, in March of 1872, Frederick Jr. passed away, and not long after him, little Robert was buried. Now, you'll never believe or guess what happened next. Joseph Natras, he came down with a gastric fever. And just before he died, he had his will redone so that Marianne got everything in it. One of Frederick's sons from his previous marriage was still alive and in Marianne's care. Can you imagine that? Well, his name was Charles, and Charles had a life insurance policy. So it was really Marianne who messed up and got herself caught. After Joseph died, a church official named Thomas Riley came to Marianne and asked her to help take care of a woman who had smallpox. Well, Marianne took him up on it, and she started to complain that her stepson Charles was in her way. So she went to Thomas Riley and asked if Charles could be taken to the workhouse. Well, back in those days, a workhouse was a place that those who couldn't support themselves could live, and they could work off their rent. Thomas Riley told her that she would need to take him there, but she replied that he wouldn't be bothering her much longer because he'd go just like the rest of the Cottons. Well, 5 days after saying that, Marianne told Thomas Riley that Charles had died. Well, Thomas Riley got suspicious, and he begged the doctor to hold off on signing a death certificate until a more thorough investigation could be done. After Charles passed away, she made a beeline for the insurance office, but they told her that they couldn't cut her a check until they had a death certificate. I bet that just pissed Marianne off. I mean, she really, by the end, should have known how things work, though. I mean, you can't get money without that certificate. But they held an inquest, and they ruled that Charles had died of natural causes. Well, Marianne said that Thomas Riley had made those accusations against her because he had came on to her and she had turned him down. So I guess it was just like revenge or whatever. But fortunately, the newspapers started picking up on Marianne's story and found that she had been moving all around the area, and in the midst of all the moving, 3 out of her 4 husbands had died. Her lover had died, her mother had died, her friend and 11 children had died from all seemingly the same illness. Coincidence? I don't think so. The local authorities started getting suspicious of Marianne, so they decided this needed to be scientifically investigated. Now, the doctor who had taken care of Charles had kept blood samples and tests, and guess what? They contained arsenic. He informed the police of this, and they arrested Marianne and charged her with the murder of Charles. But her trial was delayed until after the birth of her 13th child, which was a little girl that was born on January 10th, 1873. She finally went to trial on March the 5th, 1873. And her defense attorney argued that Charles may have had arsenic in his system, but he had accidentally inhaled it because it was used as the green dye on the wallpaper in the Cotton family residence. And then he argued that maybe the pharmacist had grabbed arsenic off the shelf instead of bismuth when he was getting medicine ready for Charles, because he had all these other people around him talking to him. Well, the jury only deliberated for like 90 minutes, and they came back with a guilty verdict. Now, a newspaper reported that Mary Ann gave this emotional outburst, but she soon straightened herself back up into the cold and caring person that she was, because she just knew. I mean, she was going to be granted clemency. I don't know why she thought that. I don't know why she thought she was above it all, but anyway. As a matter of fact, she did several appeals. She sent several appeals to the Home Secretary. They were all denied. And on March 24th, 1873, Mary Ann Cotton was hanged. She died that day not from her neck breaking, but actually she died from being strangled by a rope that was too short. And it's been rumored that it could have been intentional, that the rope was too short. So why did it take so many deaths for someone to finally realize that something was wrong there? I mean, 3 husbands, a lover, a friend, her own mother, and 11 children. It makes absolutely no sense that so many had to die. Now, I can see maybe 2 husbands dying and then things get suspicious, but not 17 people. I don't know, maybe it's because she moved around so much, and that itself should seem suspicious, or at least it does to me. And it could be that I watch too many true crime shows on TV. Well, y'all, that's all we have time for today. Catch me again on Friday evening when I'll be back with an all-new What the Friday. Y'all have a good rest of your week.
Look, it's James.